Just look at yourself. Soak it in. I mean, this sort of a thing did not happen in Europe 5 years ago. And now we're having a conference with 5,000 people and 1,500 startups in a place for some other continents. They would call it Alaska by latitude and not go there for startup events. And basically, it's amazing. Like this morning, I read about 2 of my European friends on TechCrunch, and they're all over Wired and Fast Company. It's in the media. It's in the minds and hearts of people here. What I would like to do today is to shift the world by 90 degrees and tell you a bit how it looks from the valley. How does Europe look from the valley today? And even though I'm hanging out at one of the coolest venture firms on Sandin Road these days, actually, my history with the valley goes way back, and I recently discovered that I've been living in the area for about 10% of my life now. I've gone to school there. I've done a lot of business travel for Skype. I spent the last year at Stanford, and now in the EIR role. So rather than speaking for the firm, this is my experience as a European living there. And the highlight of that experience came last year at Stanford, where I realized that in one of the leading business schools in the world, in the hub of where technology innovation happens, during 1 year, there was one professor who made one joke about Greece in the short term, and that's it. Not a single case, not a single reference, barely an incoming guest, just trying to soak the campus atmosphere in. And then I started talking to people about that, talking to investors, talking to academics, talking to serial entrepreneurs whose name we in Europe know very well. And I quickly realized that for an average person in Silicon Valley, there is a mental hierarchy of important places which looks like this. There is the valley, probably around 30-mile radius around Menlo Park, which basically the opportunity cost of missing something there is so high that you rarely look out. Then there's the US East Coast, where you sort of realize that stuff is happening in New York and Boston, but it's not as urgent happening, so you should occasionally go there. Then if you look at the map, there's a gap of distance, and then there is China. And yes, of course, China is important. There's a lot of Chinese tech companies. They're going public in the US. They're trying to acquire stuff. Then there's another gap. There is the rest of Asia. Interesting stuff. In Japan, a big diaspora of Indians living in the valley. Stuff happens. And then there is an even longer gap. And I quote, "I took my wife/husband to Paris last year. Europe is super romantic." I decided to verify this finding that Europe just doesn't exist anymore in the hearts and minds of people in Silicon Valley on my own personal network. So if you look at the map, everything on the left is either Europe or the green blob is sort of Skype internationally. So Estonia and Nordics being the blue, then it grows into Skype in Estonia, which is orange, where a lot of my network, obviously. Then it grows into Skype internationally. And what you see high up, these are some of the best-known investors and VCs on Sandin Road and some of the serial entrepreneurs. And the blob in the furthest right is the international graduate student body of Stanford. So you can see that if you believe in Granovetter's theory of strength of weak ties, we should be really joyful because the ties are really, really weak. Do we actually need them to be stronger? I think one of the realizations is so obvious that I think is lacking, is that actually in order to answer that question, European entrepreneurs first need to answer the question, why would they need those ties? Why do they need to be in the valley? What do they need from the valley? And it's a surprise to me how many of really good people from Europe fly to San Francisco, drive up to the Google campus or the Facebook campus and just do a selfie with the logo and wait for something to happen. So I think that there should be a much more honest process about thinking what's in there for you. Are you there for the clients? Are you there for the partners? Are you there to hire? What's the actual story? And only the last one of those, which for some reason always happens to be the first for many people who haven't really thought about it, is that we're here to raise money. And there is one data point for you. This doesn't really happen. I took a query from PitchBook a few days ago. These are seed stage and A round, like early stage VC investments by institutions that have been done this year. The column on the left has gone into US startups, and the column in the right has gone to European startups. As you can see, there is still very, very little cross-pollination. The picture goes better when you look at the late stage and growth stage and all of this, some of the success stories that have been discussed now. Here are examples of those. But when it comes to early stage, ironically, European investors have been investing in US more this year in early stage than vice versa. I still believe that we do need ties between Valley and Europe. It's in the benefit of both of the ecosystems, but I think my message today is that I think Europe should focus much more on the non-financial ties first, before any of the financial ones will follow. And I have two propositions for how to make that happen. The first of them is about changing the mindset. It's about going from asking for stuff to offering stuff. And while we're at it, while we're talking to each other, there's still a whole bunch of really annoying misconceptions that would make sense to fix as well while we're at it. Europe has a lot to give, guys. It's just look at the list of things. I mean, Valley is a massive talent crunch. It's really hard to hire. It's really expensive to hire. And the one way to match the talent and the challenges between each other is, of course, the natural way of people moving to the Valley. And that's the easy one, and I'm not sure if it's strategically too good for Europe, but I think there is also the opposite way. Imagine there is somebody who is the product manager number 148 working for Facebook or Google, and they have the choice of going and founding their new company and to become one of the 4,000 companies invested in the Valley in a year, or they could come to a country in Europe and be the #1 product manager in the country. I think there are amazing challenges that we could give to the American counterparts where they could have the time of their life for a few years and become more international in their mindset. There is a value we can give to them. Being a European in the Valley has occasionally made me think how hard it is to be just a good e-citizen in such a backwards place. It's still a place with checks and tax reports and paper and all of these weird things. So there are models that actually already work in many places in Europe that Americans don't have yet. Again, something for European startups and the ecosystem to give. No matter how much the map of West Coast US looks at China, it's realistically, if you look at the stories like Groupon or Airbnb or these big breakthroughs that have come in the recent years, Uber, Lyft, like these companies still look at Europe for the next 400 million users. And guess what? Who knows how to market and how to build stuff for Europeans. So we have something to give. Taking that further, something that you heard from Supercell before, which I think, and Nicholas made a great point about the Finnish and Japanese cultures being very similar. I think European companies are inherently much better at going global than many American counterparts. It's still so often that they see a US startup coming with an app built for iOS only, built in English, and has $signs hard-coded. Like, imagine the shift they need to make when they actually go to the first export market. And for many European startups, that's the DNA. So that's something for us to give. And what President Ilves was touching upon about security and privacy, again, as we need to figure this stuff out, how will we go from all the scandals of this last year, it's much more natural for US work with Europe across the Atlantic on these things rather than across the Pacific first. I mentioned the misconceptions, and funnily enough, people who know Europe in the Valley, they still say that, yeah, I've been to Europe, there's stuff happening in London and Berlin. And London and Berlin are great. I mean, it's hard to argue that's true. But what I always keep reiterating is that Europe is much larger than either of those. And it's for a good reason. Like, again, look around you. There is stuff happening in the Nordics. There is stuff happening in Prague. There is stuff happening in Barcelona. And I think the mindset of people who are trying to understand Europe should be much more about searching for the islands of excellence rather than searching for this one hub, which is sort of the model that America has evolved towards. And the subset or a derivative of that issue is the East versus West. For many of us here in Europe, this is a thing of the past. If you look at macroeconomic numbers, or if you look at youth unemployment or all these other metrics, it has rather turned into west versus east has turned into north versus south. And I'm not sure we even need to go there. It's in our benefit to avoid for that going too deep. But again, as most Americans think of the West Coast and the East Coast, applying the same parallel to Europe creates this weird misconception dynamic again that I think is worth taking your time and explaining how it really works. I have done some research and looked for argumentation or academic research that would show how this sort of focusing on non-financial ties would help us in actually building a stronger economic bridge across the Atlantic as well. And there's one piece that I consider quite interesting. There was a research done a few years ago at University of Virginia looking at correlation of US VCs investments abroad to a number of factors that they could correlate them to. And one of the clear ones they found was a correlation to the black line, which is a number or share of educated, graduating immigrants coming from those countries to US. And the red line is the number of, or the amount of VC investments happening. And what you can see that with places like Canada, China, Germany, France, India, Israel, Netherlands, South Korea, Sweden, UK, there's a very clear pattern that where people move first, where smart people go to work in another country first, the direct investments and cash flows will follow. I would extrapolate that this is a simplistic example of actual immigration, but I think it would apply to a much broader set of non-financial bridges that we could be building. So my message here today is that I think US, especially Silicon Valley, and Europe, all over the place, are in a great place in time where we have so much happening on both sides of the Atlantic. And there's so little people who really, truly understand what's happening on the other side, that we have the foundations on both sides to build much, much, much stronger bridges. And what I claim is that the wrong way to start those conversations is to go in and ask for money first. This is a longer and broader conversation that would ever fit in 15 minutes. So I plan to do a few blog posts on the topic, and I call upon you to come on and think along and argue and discuss, and most of all, act. And I think we can have a really cool outcome in the years. Thank you.